Oh, did you start the broadcast?
I think I did. Should I stop it?
Sure. Leah, if you can just start the presentation, the recording.
Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, that's good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In this session, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information, whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more. We hope that you enjoy today's session, Mitigating Leasing and Housing Problems. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsor resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Go to the next slide, please. Just for housekeeping, as a reminder for everyone joining us today, there is a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be time at the end of our webinar for question and answers. And everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any technical issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation and any resources, a recording of today's webinar is going to be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And that brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Lynette Perrell, our Senior Associate of Housing. Lynette, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will give it to you to take it from here.
Well, thank you, Joy, for having me. So let's just jump right into it because I know everybody time is precious. Next slide. So I don't know if not a lot of you know, some of you might already know because you've attended a lot of these lunch and learns with the partnership with Refugee Housing Solutions. We are part of Church World Service. And the great thing about Refugee Housing Solutions, we do partner with the State Department. So we are funded through the State Department. So I just want to make sure I put that connection that Refugee Housing Solutions is part of Church World Service as well as, so just FYI, next slide. So I'm just going to give a little bit of summary of what Refugee Housing Solution does because a lot of people really don't know about all the great services and resources we have. We do have a website. I do encourage you to go to our website, and after this presentation, there will be a link to our website. Our website have lots of materials. So when we get an opportunity, you can go to our website. And also, as you can see, if you have any questions or you have any special requests, you can go to Info Refugee Housing. Next slide. For example, we have tons of resources on our website, and I do want to highlight these two specifically. We do have a landlord toolkit, and we do have a tenant toolkit. And with our landlord toolkit, it talks about the resettlement process, what to expect when renting to a newcomer, and how an actual landlord can make their operations newcomer friendly. I do know a lot of you sponsors and volunteers, you do work with landlords. Some of you do, some of you don't. But I think this toolkit is a great resource to use if you're out there doing recruiting, or even if you're a resettlement practitioner and you're trying to recruit a landlord and they're like, look, we know nothing about resettlement. We have never housed newcomers. This toolkit is a good resource to give them the foundation about resettlement process, but also how they can make their operations newcomer friendly and still follow the fair housing laws. The one thing about our tenant toolkit, again, this population, they're new to the US rental system, and this toolkit just breaks everything down from the different documents to how to be a good tenant, what to expect in US rental history, how to build up a good U.S. rental history, and we'll talk a little bit about that also in this presentation. I want to just announce this, even though currently this toolkit is in English, we are currently in the process of translating it in 9 different languages. So hopefully in 2 months, we'll actually have this toolkit available. So I just want to put it out there. If you're interested in receiving a translation version, feel free to email me, which I will present my email address after this presentation and put you on the list to let you know, hey, the toolkit is now available in different languages. Next slide. And we do also provide housing technical assistance. So if you want some technical assistance, you can go to taa@refugeehousing.org and ask for a TA session. Next slide. And this is just a few of the topics that we talk about. I just want to highlight those things. The good thing about us, we're very flexible. We do cater to resettlement practitioners, volunteers, sponsors, but also to landlords and housing providers as well. Next slide. And booking a TA session is so simple. When you go to our website, you can book a session. They'll send you the information, asking you some general customized questions, because we want to make sure when we have a TA session with you, we are properly prepared. The good thing, I do actually do the TA for Refugee Housing Solutions. However, I have colleagues, a team on another side that has a slew of expertise. So it's not just me you get a team of experts in different capacities in different areas of housing and resettlement. Next slide. So let's go ahead and jump into this webinar. Next slide. So when I thought about this, we said rental mitigation, and I wanted to put a little bit of definition in here because I have to go up from the perspective of a landlord and work backwards. So rental mitigation means is when a landlord lessens the amount of money a tenant owns. Mitigation technically means reducing the severity. So that is what mitigation means in the rental space for a landlord. So I just want to make sure I got that definition out there, because that will help us understand what things as a volunteer and a sponsor we can help a newcomer with to mitigate cost during their rental process. Because this is what a landlord looks at when they're looking at rental mitigation. They're looking at different fees. They're looking at ways that a tenant can run up fees in different capacity of the tenure rental tenancy. So we're going to talk about each phase. Next slide. So I like to do things in order, and being in property management for almost so many years without telling my age, there is a sequence to a rental process. There's a pre-application, there's an application process, there's a pre-move-in, there's a lease up, and there's a rental tenancy, and then there's a move out. So I'm going to hit each living space, how you can mitigate issues during this cycle of a rental cycle to help a newcomer be successful at the end. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the pre-application process, because again, you want to make sure if you're working with a newcomer, you want it to go smoothly, and you want to make sure there's no barriers or issues or problems, because this is the goal of this training, is how do you prevent problems during the process. So during a pre-application process, the one thing is, if you are, depending on how you're working with your newcomer, if you're a volunteer, you're actually providing housing searches for them, or you're working with them during the pre-application process, these are the things that you can work with. Rental minimum requirements. So if you have a newcomer you're working with and they're interested in a property, or you have located a property for them, the first thing you want to make sure you read what the minimum requirements are. Because if you don't know what the minimum requirements are, and you get to that pre-application process and you actually do the application, that's when problems can arise, because they don't qualify. So that's one thing you want to make sure before you start with your newcomer. If you're working with someone, find out what the rental minimum requirements are. And that includes rental affordability. The worst thing you can do is to put someone in something they cannot afford. I know in the resettlement process, a lot of you have 90 days to get them housed. Sometimes you can have someone housed them right then and there because they're getting financial assistance, but you have to think long run because you don't want them to fall into problems 90 days after the funding or whatever support their financial support they're receiving declines, and then they're not successful. So the first thing you want to make sure that it is affordable. The rule is go 30% of income before taxes. However, with inflation, you'll be lucky if you can get someone to spend at least 40% of their income towards rent. 30% sounds good. That was an old school number we used to use, but now with inflation and the lack of affordability, you're going to see possibly paying more than 40% of one's income before taxes towards rent. And another thing you want to make sure when you're looking at affordability, you want to make sure, are there any additional expenses that are included either in the rent or outside the rent? Because that can cause problems. Because you can have this rent amount you're working with a newcomer, and they say, okay, after we do the numbers, it's considered affordable for them, but then you find out they got to pay the trash, they got to pay their sewer, and there's some additional cost that goes with that. So that's one thing you want to make sure is that you're including all the costs in the rent, what's included in the rent. And then another thing during the pre-application process is the required documentation, and this is where it gets sticky. Because again, a lot of the documentation that they're requiring, they don't have. So the things that we're going to talk about to kind of mitigate some of the problems during the pre-application process so you can be prepared to help your newcomer advocate for themselves is having supporting documentation. Make sure that they have supporting documentation ahead of time before even submitting an application. And what is that? That can be a letter of support from the resettlement agency that you're working with, the promissory note. I know we're working with a lot of affiliates to create a promissory note outlining what type of financial support they're getting, but not just financial, even outlining the case management, the wraparound services that they're receiving. If you are working with assisting in getting a supporting documentation, one thing I have recommend when you put in that letter to make them stand out, talk about this is a type of tenant that's beyond another applicant, I'm sorry, because they're receiving not just financial support, they're receiving a village to support them. Another thing that we are currently working on with the State Department is getting a letter of support from the State Department to make it look more official, because a lot of landlords and housing providers are still leery about newcomers not having jobs, not having income, and verifying that they are receiving support from the State Department. We are getting that letter. It's in the process of getting approval. However, until then, I do recommend that you work with your regional HUD representative. If you know who your HUD representative is, I can make sure all that information gets to you, and contacting them and getting a letter of support until we can get that State Department support. And I'm going to talk about the explanation letter of alternative documentation, how you can actually advocate during the pre-application process so they can accept the alternative documentation. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But then also during the pre-application process, look at the application fee. Be prepared for that, because you don't want to run into problems where they get excited, they see a unit they want to apply for, and you don't have the money for the application fee, but then also you don't have the form of payment, because now everything is online. Some won't even take, of course, cash. That no one ever takes cash, but you want to make sure before you do the application, you see their form of payment. Do they take money orders? What's the amount? So you already have that prepared. So that's how you can kind of cut down on some of the time-consuming mistakes in the pre-application process. Next slide. And I want to highlight this, and I don't want to stay too long on this, but I think this is very important, and I'm an example type of person. With Operation Allies Welcome, one of the things that HUD did state that credit check policy exceptions, and that's one thing that they do during the application process. They do credit checks, and of course, they don't have credit here. So this is how you can advocate for your newcomer during the application process. And this is what HUD says. HUD has put this statement out, and this was for Operation Allies Welcome. And the question was, if a landlord or property manager requires credit checks at admissions, may the landlord or property manager forego credit checks for Afghan refugees or parolees. Even though that says Afghan refugees or parolees, guess what? That expands to other populations because you have to meet the fair housing laws. So this is what their response is. Yes, landlords and property managers may generally forego credit checks for any potential resident as long as they do not discriminate because of protected characteristics under the Fair Housing Act. And that is one of the things a lot of housing providers are scared to forego a credit check because they're scared they're going to not meet the fair housing law requirements. So this is documentation you can use to forego that. The next slide. And again, here's just a continuation. The credit check exception is made because of immigration status. The exception must apply equally to all those in immigration status and not only those of a certain nationality. So even though that it says Afghan, this expands to other populations as well. So I just wanted to highlight that. Next slide. And again, alternative documentation, the screening criteria. So usually when they're doing the screening criteria, they're looking for proof of identity, and typically they're going to ask for a driver's license or a state ID. If you're already prepared to advocate, you can say, I get that's what your screening criteria, because your goal is to prove their identity. You can say traveling documents and I-94. So if you're working with a newcomer, make sure they have their traveling documents together or the I-94 card, because that proves their proof of identity. Another thing is the ability to pay. They do credit reports. That's what that is screening for. And income verification, that promissory note from the resettlement affiliate outlining their financial support will meet that criteria of their ability to pay. Again, a criminal history background check, that I-94, you should advocate, hey, they're the most vetted individuals in the United States. In fact, them being vetted supersedes your criminal history, your basic criminal screening history that you do in the application process. So that's how you can prevent some of these barriers that happen. And again, the rental history, of course, they don't have U.S. rental history. The letter of support showing what type of services they're getting from the resettlement affiliate will cover that screening criteria. Next slide. So we talked about pre-application, the things that you can do to be preemptive to prevent barriers. So let's talk about the application process. So the one thing you want to do once they get to the point where they're actually going to do the application, I recommend that you inspect the unit if it's available, because sometimes units are not available to view before actually filling out during the application process. However, you want to inspect the unit because you want to make sure that it meets the needs of the actual newcomer. Because the last thing you want to do is put them in a legal lease and it does not meet their actual needs of their family or the family composition, because I do know a lot of you guys are working with larger families. During the application process, to stop some of the problems, make sure they understand the application and the process. Remember, this is a lease. This is a legal binding document. So in order to make sure there's no confusion or problems during the application process, make sure there's translation support during the application process to explain the application, but also to explain the lease eventually. So that is something. I do know a lot of newcomers, not all newcomers, but I do know not just even newcomers, even in my different jobs, I would see people use either trusted family members or children to help with translation. I'm going to say this for best practices. I would not recommend anybody under the age of 18 doing translation support. And the reason why, in order to enter into a contract, you have to be over the age of 18. So why would you have someone under the age of 18 doing a translation for a contract? So I just want to put that out there. And another thing in the application process you want to make sure there's no issues is, depending if it's a paper application, if they're filling out a paper application, make sure again they can understand it, but also that it's legible. When I used to be a property manager, I hate to say this, back in the day when we had paper applications, because some still do, if something was not legible, guess what? It got tossed away or it got put back. I hate to say this, but it does happen. So in order to prevent that, make sure before they submit it, it's legible. Now with the electronic one, make sure that it's submitted properly, everything has been filled out, because the last thing is that once you think you submitted and you didn't get a confirmation, it can be in the holding pattern in their a holding pattern. So if you're going to help them do an application virtually online, make sure you receive a confirmation that it has been completed. Next slide, please. So we talked about the application and just say that it got accepted, they got approved, and they have been assigned a unit. So the next phase would be the pre-move-in phase. So things you want to make sure that the pre-move-in phase or the leasing phase goes smoothly is, again, forwarding addresses. You might have some stuff, well, make sure they have the forwarding address because you want to make sure they get all their mail, their important documentation. They can be contacted by case managers or anybody they're working with because they could have some pending business things to do. Make sure that they have their utility services set up because all properties won't even let you move in unless you have documentation proving that your utilities have been set up, unless the utilities included in the actual lease. Now that's something different. So make sure that's set up, and also check to make sure rental insurance information has already been submitted, because again, some apartment complexes, they will not let you move in until you actually show proof of your rental insurance. Next slide. So now we're we call it the lease up phase. That's when they're actually going to sign their lease. So the one thing I recommend highly before anyone, even if you're not a newcomer, sign a lease, walk through the actual unit that's on the lease. So get the lease first, review it, look at the address in the unit and say, I want to do the walkthrough before I sign the lease, because you want to make sure whatever legal document you're signing, that's where you're going to actually be living, or the newcomer is going to be living. So look at the lease, then look at the unit and say, I want to do an inspection. And when you do the inspection, they call it a different thing depending on where you're at. Is either called a move-in or a move-out checklist or inspection checklist. But you're supposed to get a checklist when you do your inspection, when you do your walkthrough before you sign your lease. So I just want to put that caveat. Some terminology is slightly different, but you should get a checklist to do that inspection at walkthrough. And I recommend now with such savvy technology, take pictures. Take pictures of the unit. If there's something that's wrong with the unit during the walkthrough, point it out, document it on the checklist, have the newcomer document on the checklist, take pictures of it, and make management aware of, okay, these are the issues that we see on the unit. How soon can they be corrected? Because the last thing you want to do is have a newcomer move out and they get blamed for damage that was already there. So that's how you want to prevent problems in the first place when it comes to damage to a unit or a home. So document that in your move-in checklist, and also make sure they turn it in a timely manner, because I do know sometimes they require you to turn it in a week or 2 weeks after the fact. Make sure the newcomer turned it in an appropriate time, but also have a copy. So before they turn it in to the management, recommend that they get a copy of that actual checklist with management signature, because then you guys can say, okay, we both verified this is the damage that already had been done to the unit. Now we're going to go back to after the walkthrough and you did the inspection with the newcomer. Review again the lease. This is very important. Review the lease and make sure they understand the lease before signing. And again, provide translation support. Make sure that they understand this is a legal document, so they understand every aspect of the lease. And I'm not going to highlight all the lease terms, but I'm going to highlight some of the lease terms that are very important that can cause future problems if not paying attention or not abiding by it. So the one lease terms I want to talk about is the start and end date of the lease. Make sure that they know that, because that's very important. Then also when monthly rent is due. because again, you got to know when to pay their rent, how to pay it, the methods of payment, and the due dates. Because again, they need to know what the late charges are and what are the penalties if they don't pay their rent on time. I've seen landlords literally run late fees to a point where a person has gotten evicted due to not because of the late fees. They couldn't keep up with paying the late fees and the rent. So that's very important that they understand that in their terms of their lease. Another thing is utilities, what utilities are included or not included. So they need to know what they are responsible for paying. Now, I want to point this out so this can prevent any problems. Now, any utilities that the landlord is responsible for is going to be in that lease. So say, for example, if the landlord said they're going to pay the electric, and this has happened, and it's in the lease, and guess what? They come home one day and there's no electricity. Guess what? They're not responsible for paying that if it's in the lease that the landlord would pay it. So they need to make sure if the landlord states they're going to pay certain utilities, they hold them accountable when they don't, if there's no service. So I just want to make sure I point that out. Again, the rental insurance requirements, and we're going to talk about the notice of vacate, which has been a big problem in the resettlement space. The reason why is because a lot of them will sign a lease and don't realize they have to give proper notice to vacate. And guess what? They don't give the proper notice due to either reselling out of the area or being reunified to another family member in a different state. They break their lease, and guess what? They've already started out with a bad rental history because they didn't give proper notice to vacate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then also renewal conditions. When they have, if they decide they want to renew their lease, that should be in the lease terms and how they go about doing it. So the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the actual rental tenancy. They're now leased up, they're in their unit, living great. So again, the thing is they want to make sure to prevent any problems to pay their rent on time because they read their lease, so they know when their rent is due and they know when the late fee kicks in. Another thing to do, best practices to prevent future problems, is to make sure that they submit maintenance orders in a timely manner. The last thing you want to do is have an actual issue with the unit and keep postponing that actual repair. And guess what? The repair gets out of control, and then that's going to be taken out of their deposit. So it's very important that they submit maintenance repairs in a timely manner to the actual landlord to prevent that. Submit proper notice of vacate, like I talked about early, just a few seconds ago. This helps them prevent early termination fees. So let's go a little bit into what a notice of vacate is. So a notice of vacate, this is a form either used by a landlord or a tenant to notify the other party that they do not intend to renew the lease or their rental agreement. Now, I want to highlight this. Now, notice of vacate, it does varies from state to state how much notification you have to give. But again, it should be in the lease. And here are the consequences if a newcomer does not do proper notice of vacate. One thing can happen, a lease could either be extended beyond what they want it to be, early termination fees. I've seen termination fees where, again, depending on what the lease says and what state you're in, it could be either 2 months of rent, or I've seen where they're responsible for the remainder of the lease. So say, for example, I always use Miss I Need a Home. You're working with I Miss Need a Home. She leases up, and within 2 months of her lease, she doesn't give proper notice of vacate because she's resettled out. Guess what? She could be possibly responsible for those 10 months remainder on that lease. So it's depending on how the lease is written and also what state you're in. So next slide, please. Enjoy, I'm trying to watch my time. The example, this is the example, I'm an example type of person. So this is an example of a lease, just a section out of it. So the initial term of the lease contract, it begins for first day of December 2023, and it ends 11:59 p.m. on the 30th day of November 2024. So this is what the lease says. So the lease contract does not automatically renew, so that means it doesn't renew. So if you move out the premise before the expiration of the lease contract term, You must give at least 60 days written notice of your intent to move out as required by paragraph 44. So this is part of, I just took an example out of the lease. I'm just using this example. So I'm gonna break it down again. This is when a lease starts, December 1st. This is when it ends, November 30th. It ends. However, based on this lease term, you would have to give 60 days written notice that you're going a notice to vacate. Okay. So with that being said, in order to be in compliance with your notice to vacate, you need to submit it no later than October 1st of 2024. So say if this was part of my lease and I don't want to renew my lease, I want to give a notice to vacate to my landlord, I would have to give it to my landlord October 1st, 2024 in order to be in compliance, because based on my lease, it says I have to give them 60 days written notice. So next slide. And this is just an example what a notice to vacate looks like. I want to add this disclaimer. Depending on your property, some properties require you to write it out, the notice to vacate. Other properties actually have a form. Most properties are very sophisticated, so usually they already have a form for you to fill out to do the notice to vacate. So this is just one example of what a notice to vacate looks like. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit, even though it's unpleasant. You know, everybody has good intentions to be a good tenant, to do things, but evictions do happen, unfortunately, or eviction filing has happened. So I want to tell you a little bit of some best practice you can do to prevent the eviction from being on a newcomer's record. The one thing is to possibly do rental assistant programs, find if there's rental assistant programs that are available to help assist with the rent. One thing I would tell a client when I was working with a client, even though I didn't want them to get to that point, even if they were doing good, I would say, look, if you fall in any type of trouble, please let me know before it gets too bad so we can find some resources to, you know, rectify the situation. Don't wait till you get a notice before you come to me and say, hey, look, I need some help. Now, I do know a lot of you, some of you only work with newcomers for 90 days. But still put that in your mind. Even if you find yourself falling in a little bit of trouble, try to locate an agency that can help you before it gets too bad. Also, legal aid. Even though everything's going well, I also recommend everybody always find out where the legal aid agency is in their area, not just for evictions, just for fair housing laws, just in case you have any questions or you feel that any discrimination has happened with the client. Just build a relationship with them and educate yourself on fair housing laws. The best mitigation practice during a possible eviction is see if you can work with them, with the landlord, to arrange a payment plan, even though, say, for example, they might be $2,000 in debt, rental debt. Still work out a payment plan if they can pay $20, $30 towards it, whatever is reasonable without breaking them financially, and get it in writing. But also do a deed of surrender. People are like, what is a deed of surrender? Work with the landlord to come out with a reasonable move-in date to surrender the unit, so they won't file the eviction and it won't be on their actual record. I know people say, well, sometimes it's best to write out an eviction because it buys time and they have a place to stay until the eviction. No, because in the long run, it's going to affect them trying to lease up with another landlord. So it's possibly best to find other options instead of writing out an eviction. Next slide. So we talked about that these are the things possibly you can prevent to happen during the actual rental tenure. So let's talk about now your newcomer. If you're at a point you're going to help a newcomer move out, the one thing you need to do is make sure, again, forwarding addresses, everything is there. Disconnect utility services. The last thing you want to do, say if they've been paying their utilities on time and they move out, and guess what? There are some people who actually move in that unit and will use their utility service and will say, hey, wait a minute, the utilities is in someone else's name. There's not people that ethical. So the best thing to do is to make sure that they disconnect all utility services in that unit, pay any outstanding rental balances. That prevents any problems in the future of running up with any other landlords or even coming up with a payment plan, because at least say if there is some rental debt and they want to rent up somewhere else, and it does come up with the new possible landlord, they can say, hey, look, I'm still trying to be responsible. Here is my payment plan that I have made arrangements for them to show that I'm going to pay my debt, my rental debt. And then again, schedule a final walkthrough. Again, that is so important. The reason why is because if you don't schedule a final walkthrough and the housing provider does the walkthrough and you just leave the unit blindly, they can blame any wear or tear, anything beyond wear or tear on the newcomer. And guess what? That'll be part of their debt. That could be added on to their rental debt, but also that affects them getting part of their deposit back. So that's very important that they do that walkthrough again and have their original walkthrough paper, their checklist, what they did when they did their move-in. So if the housing provider has to say something to the walk, say, okay, there's damage you did right there. And they can say, oh no, remember when we did our original walkthrough, I have documentation to prove that was there before I moved in. So that's very important. And the benefits of a proper move out, again, doing the notice to vacate in a proper manner, doing the walkthrough, making sure they leave the unit in best possible shape. Again, there's basic wear and tear. And okay, let me back that up. I want to say this. Each state has an outline of what is considered basic wear and tear, and a landlord cannot charge for basic wear and tear. So find out in your state, what are the basic wear and tear laws, okay? So that's very important. So if you're working with a newcomer that's moving out of a unit, they know what their rights are when it comes to being charged beyond basic wear and tear. Because that prevents a lot of problems, especially when it comes to the dispute of how much of their deposit they should get back. Again, the benefits of a proper move out, it leaves the tenant in good standing. They're in compliance with their lease. It also, again, increases their chances of receiving a higher security deposit, and it prevents early termination fees, and it prevents a negative rental history, which in turn helps them build a positive landlord reference. Next slide. So I think I made my time. So that is my presentation. Again, my name is Lynette Pearl. And if you have additional questions after this webinar, feel free to email me at lpearl@cwsglobal.org, or you can go to our website and you can actually set up a TA session. I do one-on-one TA sessions as well, not just me, also with my team members. If you feel that it has to be an ongoing TA, we do that as well. There's times that I have, in fact, there's some people I've worked with for 3 to 4 months on ongoing projects. That's what we're here for. So I am going to turn it back to you, Joy.
Thank you so much, Lynette. That was very helpful and definitely great to just take us through the process and the things to watch out for and to walk our refugee families with. All right, so now we are going to answer the questions that you submitted. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions box in your control panel. We have a question from Sarah. She's asking about where she can find the regional HUD representative letter and the OAW letter.
Okay, the welcome ILAs, the letter I showed in the presentation, it's on HUD's website. Feel free to email me and I can send that to you directly, because sometimes it's hard to navigate the HUD's website. And also I can forward you your HUD regional. If you just tell me where you're located, and I can give you your HUD regional information as well. Because sometimes it's difficult to navigate through HUD's website, but I already have that online for that, so.
Thank you. And another thing that I have noticed personally with some refugee families is that they don't take the breaking of the lease seriously, or they hear from other refugees that they were able to get out of the penalty just by saying, you know, a family member is sick or something, but then they end up not having the same situation. So they end up actually having to pay the 2 months penalty plus 2 months of lease. And then they think if they just ignore it, that it's just gonna just go away. What's your advice on how to deal with a situation like this?
To remind them again, remember you're in a great situation because you're coming with a blank slate. But the minute that you ignore that rental debt, now your slate has been already, you have a barrier. You already have barriers because you don't have a true rental history here, but if you have that rental debt, it's going to be very difficult for you to find affordable housing, or you're going to find someone who's going to charge you additional rent rates because you are a risk. Or, you've been in this, you have a short tenure, you don't want to mess that up, because that's the goal, is to build up your rental history, to have a positive rental history. And also that doesn't just affect just your rent, it also affects your utilities as well. They look at how you are as a renter in general. And yeah, it's not good to, I don't know why people ignore it, even though this is the one misconception. People think that it's not on your credit, but it is. It is placed on your credit.
Yeah. Thank you. And another question, what is your thoughts on co-signing? This is something that I have seen a lot, that people ask for co-signing for the contract. What's your thoughts on that? Or yeah, what advice would you give?
The agency co-signing or an individual co-signing?
Well, agencies, I know that many can't, but either way, both and, yeah. Individual or agency.
I wouldn't recommend either. I shouldn't say that.
Yeah.
As an individual, unless you really know that newcomer, again, you're putting yourself, your financial situation at risk if you co-sign. You already know as a co-signer. One thing I have recommend, not being a co-signer, but possibly being a rental guarantee person, individual, is saying, okay, if they do fall in a little bit of trouble, I'm willing to pay the rent to cover that, but not to actually sign a lease. Because if you sign a lease, then you're legally responsible, versus you can say, I can guarantee the rent, versus you're going to be legally responsible if you're living there. One thing I am been working with one of our Ava, is master leases. We are trying to template a master lease for affiliates to use, because I do know a lot of these organizations cannot do the co-signing. But a master lease is when you actually work with the actual landlord and housing provider, and they work with an agency. And for simplicity purpose, say for example, they say, okay, if you work with us, Refugee Housing Solutions, and give us 5 units, they'll put those 5 units in Refugee Housing Solutions' name. And then what we do, we actually will lease up those 5 units to newcomers. And so I do recommend master leases. I've worked with master leases when I work with the veteran population, but I'm very leery about co-signing, especially as an individual, unless you are really, you really can vouch for that person, or you'll prepare yourself if they default on that lease. Can you afford to take on that debt?
Thank you, Lynette. And that's going to be our last question. We can go to the next slide. We thank you again for our presenter today, Lynette. You have been great. And thank you everyone for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. We would like to hear from you and receive your feedback on today's webinar and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. We ask that you take a minute now to complete a survey. So if you use your phone and you follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link in the chat. We look forward to hearing from you. And again, you will receive an email with a follow-up link to the webinar that we had today. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.